will post a survey at the end of this session. It'll be in the chat. You'll see it over on the likely right-hand side if you're using a desktop or a laptop computer. All you have to do is click on that chat and fill out that survey for us. It helps us a lot in planning future events, especially ones like this. So thanks for joining us. I am going to introduce first Geraldine. Geraldine is the OLLI director in Iowa who is working with us, and we are having so much fun working together. Geraldine, I would love it if you would introduce Mary Lou for us.
I would be so pleased to introduce Mary Lou. Mary Lou has been an OLLI at Iowa State University member since fiscal year 16. And during that time, she has attended 71 courses and she's taught 21 courses, coordinated 4 day trips, and she's a member of the curriculum committee. Along with the Women Who Serve series of presentations, which you're going to see one of those today. She has also offered courses on how to play the Native American style flute 5 times, along with another course called Sharing Your Story, Writing Your Own Obituary. She's done that 5 different times. I know that sounds awful, but it is such a great class for people to think about and do ahead of time. She's got so many great, wonderful exercises. So Mary Lou, thank you so much for being our presenter today.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you. Oh, participants can now see my screen. Okay, just a minute.
There it is.
Okay, thank you all so much for joining me today. I'm pretty excited to be doing this. So today we are going to be talking about the alphabet women of World War II. So these were the Marine Corps Women's Reserve, the WAVs, the WACs, the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, which later changed into the Women's Army Corps, and the SPARs. So you see them, they're from the bottom up. We have the Marine Corps Women's Reserve woman here in her uniform. And you'll notice that the U.S. Navy uniform and the U.S. Coast Guard uniform are identical. And the only difference is the insignia that they have on their uniforms. And then we have the Marine Corps women, we have the, oh, excuse me, this is the wax down at the bottom, I apologize. And then we've got the Marine Corps Women's Reserve, followed by the Coast Guard. So a lot of people wonder how I got interested in this subject. And I actually joined the Army in 1977, and I joined the Women's Army Corps. I received a direct commission into the Women's Army Corps. And today with me in this class, I have several of the women who also went into the Women's Army Corps on this date in July. So thank you all for joining me. I really, really appreciated that. So we received direct commissions as second lieutenants. Some of us received a direct commission as first lieutenants if they had a master's degree. There were 127 of us. So I joined 126 other women for this class. We basically were all teachers or administrators, secretaries is the basic thing. And I think we had a couple of former nuns who were members of our class. We started out in the Women's Army Corps, and the Women's Army Corps was going away at that point in time. We were the last class, the last direct commission class into the Women's Army Corps. And so before the class was even over, we branch transferred to other branches within the military. And then we went out into the military and served in those branches when our class was over. So it was a very interesting time for women in the military, in the Army at that point in time. the exciting thing was that if you were a second lieutenant, it didn't matter whether you were a man or whether you were a woman, you received a second lieutenant's pay. So we had equal pay. And that was absolutely unheard of in the civilian world. That just did not happen, that you had equal pay. Did we have equal opportunity? We certainly did not have equal opportunity. But we had a lot more opportunity than we would have had if we had remained civilians and not gone into the military. So we had increased opportunities in the military. So these are a couple pictures. I just wanted to share these pictures because they really tell a story of women in the military at this point in time. So starting with their top left picture, this is me in Korea. You'll notice I'm the only woman there. And on top right picture, I'm at Fort Sheridan, Illinois, where we're doing a parade through the town. And you'll see that I am a member of the staff, again, the only woman on the staff. Down at the bottom, this is me with the company commanders of my battalion, the battalion I was in, and again, the only woman. Now the bottom right one, this is so very, very interesting. There are 4 women in this picture. 3 of them are in civilian clothes. They were Department of Army civilians. I was the only woman in this class. This was the Public Affairs Officers course. I was the only woman in this class. And you'll notice I'm at the very, very, very back. How did that happen? Well, they like to put people in order. So they had, by their ranks. So they had all of the senior officers at the front. And here I am, very, very short. And I'm in the very back row. And I think that really tells you something about women in the military at that point in time. So I had a good career. I was a basic training company commander. I was a detachment commander and a military police detachment commander. I served basically in public affairs. And after I got out of the military, I wrote my dissertation on this group of women that I went into the military with. And that dissertation is called The Last WACs. And it tells the story of these women that I went into the military with. So if you look up my dissertation, don't bother reading the dissertation itself. Go directly to the appendices and read the stories of these 5 women, because their stories are pretty universal. The experiences they had were very similar to the experiences that I had. And it was just an interesting time for women in the military. It was before women graduated from West Point. Women had not yet graduated from ROTC. And so we were just kind of out there and alone, doing the best job that we could do. So as Geraldine said, this is part of a series that I have done on women who served. So I started out with this series talking about the women who served as soldiers, nurses, wives, and spies through the American Revolution up through the Spanish-American War. Then we did a class on the Army and Navy Nurse Corps. We did a class on the women volunteers in World War I. And then we looked at the military women in World War I. And then this class on the alphabet women of World War II. So this is part of a series. So I don't cover everything, but I had a couple of classes, a couple of questions about the Nurse Corps. The Nurse Corps was not part of the Women's Army Corps. The Nurse Corps was a separate corps, and it was established, the Army Nurse Corps was established in 1901. The Women's Army Auxiliary Corps was not established until 1942. So, and the Navy Nurse Corps was established in 1908. So women had worked as nurses from the American Revolution on. And I just put this pay down because I thought it was very interesting. in the American Revolution, they received $2 per month to be a nurse. And it didn't increase very much by the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, only $30. World War I, $60. And then finally in World War II, they were making $70. And by the end of World War II, they had been given relative rank, and they were then making what their male compatriots made with the same rank. So we had, at the beginning of World War II, we had 800 active duty Navy nurses on active duty and less than 7,000 active duty Army nurses. By the end of World War II, we had 57,000 Army nurses on active duty, and we had 11,000 Navy nurses on active duty. In 1944, the Navy nurses were given actual military rank and pay, and in the relative rank in the Army was given in 1920, but they did not receive the pay until the same time that the Navy women received the pay, but the relative rank was given back in 1920. And when I say relative rank, that means that they were given the same ranks as the males. They didn't have these strange ranks, these strange rank structure. So during World War I, we did have women who served in the military. We had the yeomanettes, the marinettes, and we had the hello girls. And what happened basically was that the Navy, their law for the Naval Reservist requirement just listed persons. The Army law for the reserve lists male persons. And so the Navy decided that they could put women into the reserves. And so that's where you get the marinettes, the yeomanettes and the marinettes, because the Marines fell under the Navy Department. So we had 12,000 women who served in the Navy during World War I, and they basically received the same pay and benefits as the men. All of their service was done in the United States. They never left the continental United States, and after the war, they were given general discharges, which many were later changed to honorable, and they did receive veterans benefits. And a lot of them actually remained on as civilian employees of the Department of the Navy. The marinettes, there were much fewer of them. The recruitment began for them in 1918, and they had thousands of women who lined up to apply, and they only accepted 305. There were only 305 Marine reservists during World War I. They basically served in clerical positions, and at the end of the war, they were given discharges and they received veterans benefits, which included the ability to be buried at Arlington. And again, many stayed on in civilian positions after the war. The next group of women were the Army's hello girls. And while the others had options, the hello girls did not have a lot of options, because they found out after they served that they had not actually been in the Army, that women could not be a part of the Army, and that their service was not recognized as being military service. So these were the women who connected the phone calls, and they served probably within a mile of the front lines all of the time that they were there, and they served overseas. When they got back, they found out when they tried to join the American Legion or the Veterans of Foreign Wars, they were not able to do that because their service had not been recognized. If you could see a close-up of these women, you would see that they're wearing military uniforms. You would see that the buttons that they are wearing are the same buttons that were on the male of the Army, the other Army uniforms. They wore the same buttons. They wore Signal Corps insignia. They were subjected to the Uniform Code of Military Justice, but they were not military. And they fought basically a 60-year battle trying to get their service recognized as having been military service. That service was finally recognized in 1977. It took them 2 years to get their discharge paperwork together. And by the time they had these ceremonies, there were only 18 of the 233 telephone operators still living. So those are our women who served during World War I. And that brings us up to World War II. So the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps was established on May 14th, 1942. But they had decided probably a year to a year and a half in advance of this bill being approved that they were going to put women into the military if indeed we did end up going to war. So there had been some planning that was going on in the background, and Ovida Kalpabi, who became the first director of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps and later the Women's Army Corps, was helping to work those issues. So she became a very logical choice to be the first director of the Women's Army Corps. So that was established on May 14th, 1942. The Naval Women's Reserve was established on July 30th, and because the Marine Corps fell also under the Navy Department, theirs was also established on July 30th. But they did not enlist women. They were the last ones to actually begin adding women to their service. They did not begin enlisting women until February of 1943. The Coast Guard Women's Reserve was not established until November 23rd, 1942, but by December of 1942, they already had at least 1,000 members in the Coast Guard. And so they moved very, very quickly. So this is going to be the order in which we will be discussing these women and the services today. We're going to start with the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, go down to the Navy Women's Reserve. We're going to skip the Marines because they delayed putting women in, and we're going to go to the Coast Guard, and then we're going to come back and talk about the Marine Women's Reserve. So the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, the bill establishing the WAC was signed into law on May 15th, 1942. The bill had actually been put forward a year earlier, but did not really garner any support until after we had been bombed in Pearl Harbor. So Ovida Kalpabi was appointed the first director on May 16th, immediately after the Corps had been established. And by December of 1942, 13,000 women had already been trained in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. And during the war, over 150,000 women served in either of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps or the WAC. So we had quite a few women take advantage of that. Edith Norris Rogers is the one who wrote the bill, the two bills. She served in Congress from 1924 until she died in 1960. She actually is the one who every year would submit a bill trying to get the Hello Girls, get their recognized. And so she was very, very cognizant of what these women who served in World War I and didn't get their service recognized were missing. And so she wanted to ensure that this did not happen again. And so she wrote the bill, and of course it got massaged and everything else. And there were certain things that weren't in it that she had wanted in it, but she she was able to get some protections for the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. So on May 15th, the WAC Act was signed into law, creating a corps of up to 150,000 women. Basically, they were going to serve as non-combatants with the U.S. Army. And then later, they then did the Women's Army Corps Bill. They determined that if they were going to send women overseas, and we sent a lot of Army women overseas, that they really needed to be part of the Army. If they weren't part of the Army, they didn't fall under the status of forces agreements. They also did not, the Geneva Convention did not apply to them. And there were several other things. And so when this Women's Army Corps bill was passed, what happened was that the women who served in the WAAC had not enlisted in the Women's Army Corps. They had enlisted in the WAAC. And so they had the option to leave the service at that time if they wanted to. They did not need to continue on into the Women's Army Corps because it actually was a separate organization. And in fact, the DD-214s of the women who went into the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps did not count their service in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps towards anything. So they had to raise their right hands and join the Army just as the men did. And a lot of them decided not to. One of the reasons why they decided not to was at that time they had what was later termed as the smear campaign. The smear campaign was a series of articles that were printed in newspapers and that stated basically that these women in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps had extremely low morals. And in fact, that they were being issued prophylactics so that when they got out and went to work within the Army, they would be able to service the troops sexually. That was how blatant it was. And of course, there were many family members, fathers, husbands, brothers, who heard about this, who read this and heard about this, and they really, really discouraged their daughters and sisters from going into the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps or the WACs. And so there was a period of time, that was another reason why a lot of them chose to get out, was because they were being pressured by the male members of their households, to get out of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps and not be associated with these women of low morals. And it also caused a problem with accessing women into the Women's Army Corps because this was going on. And so there was a lag for a period of time in being able to access women into the Women's Army Corps. There were congressional hearings on the smear campaign, investigations into it to see whether there was any legitimacy to it. And of course, the outcome was that there was absolutely no legitimacy to this, no truth to this, but that didn't make any difference. The word was out there, and it was just something that the Women's Army Corps had to live with. So the first officer training happened in July 20th, 1942, and it happened at Fort Des Moines. So this is our Iowa connection to the Women's Army Corps. They chose to come to Fort Des Moines. So why did they choose to come to Fort Des Moines? Well, a lot of these services were moving different trainings into colleges, and they could not find a college that was vacant, that had the room, the capacity to be able to use. So they were looking for a place that had the room. And so Fort Des Moines did have the room, and not only so, it was chosen because it was, number one, available, And number two, it was chosen because it was in the center of the country. Most of the news originated on either seaboard. So on the West Coast or the East Coast was where the news originated. Some of it came from Chicago, but Chicago was still a ways away from Des Moines, Iowa. So it was kind of an isolated spot. And this was a new thing that they had going on. They were also training the black male officers at Fort Des Moines. So this was a place where they could kind of keep things a little hidden and away from the media. And so that is why Fort Des Moines was chosen. So there were 35,000 women who applied for less than 1,000 slots as officers. And the first class that started had 440 members. Now, 40 of those members were Black women. And so Black women had been a part of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps from the very, very beginning, and are probably the most famous unit, women's unit in the Women's Army Corps was a Black unit, the 6888 Postal Directory unit. They were sent to Europe, to Germany. I mean, not to Germany, but they were sent to Europe. And because there was a mail, a backup of mail, and they got there and the mail was stacked, literally. There were warehouses where the mail was stacked to the rafters, and it had been there for months and months. And they anticipated that it would take this unit about 8 months to clear out this backlog. But they were a really go-to unit and a very hard-working unit, took everything very seriously, and they had everything cleared out within 3 months. And so they did an amazing job, and they're probably the most famous WAC unit that we have. So why did the women join the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps? Well, they joined mainly for patriotic reasons. 1 in 5 had a male family member who was in the armed forces. There were women who were combat widows and decided that they would take their husband's place. One woman had a son who was unable to serve, and so she decided that she would serve. And one woman served because there were no males in her family, and she thought she would serve. But they all desired to do something patriotic and to actually aid their country and release a man for combat. So they did this for patriotic reasons. And I think they also did it because it was something different and something new and something that women had never been able to do before. And so I think there was a sense of kind of adventure and being able to do something different. We are going to look at Staff Sergeant Mary Lou Drake. Now, Staff Sergeant Mary Lou Drake is the aunt of one of our OLLI members in Iowa, Daryl Drake. And so Daryl Drake, upon his aunt's death, received his aunt's scrapbook. And so Daryl and I have pieced this together about his Aunt Mary Lou based on the things in the scrapbook. Now, Daryl never really asked a lot of questions. Mary Lou never shared a lot. And so some of these things we have surmised, but this is Mary Lou's story. So Mary Lou was born in Brooklyn, Iowa in 1909, and she graduated from Brooklyn High School. And when she graduated, she went to the Iowa State Teachers College at the University of, well, it's now UNI, but the Iowa State Teachers College, and became a teacher. She taught home economics and taught it in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. She joined the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps on August 10th, 1942. Now that's a very, very important date, because you will see that the first class of enrollees or enlisted people actually joined. The first class started on August 17th. So she joined on August 10th. And by looking at her records, it looks to us like she attended this first class in August of 1942. Now, the women who had, the 35,000 women who had applied for slots to be for 1,000 officers, they could go ahead and join, enlist, and they didn't have to reapply. If they wanted to, they could enlist. And so many of them did. And after this first class was trained, women were chosen then from the enrollee ranks, enlisted ranks, then to go to the officer training. So the first class was a direct commission class. They were given commissions and went to the school, learned how to be an officer, and then went out into the military. So the training that they received at Fort Des Moines, this first class, there were no women to train them, and so they were basically trained by men. And eventually, the women who were trained in that class and subsequent classes took over the training. So the training was actually done by women later on, but the first training of the women in the WAAC was done by men. So they were putting so many women into the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps and later the WAC Corps that they had to have other training sites. And so other training sites were established at Daytona Beach, Florida, Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, and Fort Devens, Massachusetts. But they continued to train women at Fort Des Moines all the way through World War II. So we have a picture of Mary Lou in uniform, and she is with the entourage of Eleanor Roosevelt, who came to look at the training and observe the training. And I checked out the date, and the date that Eleanor Roosevelt came to Fort Des Moines was in February of 1943. So we know that Mary Lou took her basic training at Fort Des Moines. And then we also know that she took a 3-week motor course in October of 1942. So while she was taking this motor course, she wrote a letter to her students back in Cedar Rapids. And this letter was printed in the Cedar Rapids Gazette. So this is a picture of Mary Lou driving the Jeep and Mary Lou in her WAAC uniform. So the letter reads, "Hello, there's never a dull moment here in the Motor Corps. In 3 weeks of special training, I have learned to drive Jeeps, trucks, carryalls, command cars, and weapon carriers. Jeeps are fun, especially on the hazard course, when the ditches have 45-degree slopes. This week we took our driver's tests and have been grease monkeys. We have packed front wheels, cleaned air filters, drained transmission, differential oils, and have used grease guns for chassis lubrication. And even in the Army, there's lots of stuff. We had an examination every day this week. We are studying the internal combustion engine, map reading, safe driving, fire prevention, loads and loading, road signs and signals, difficult driving, and other subjects. Next week, I will have convoy driving and blackout driving. I love my work and find it exciting and interesting. I think of you and hope you will visit me when you are in Des Moines. Cheerio," signed Mary Lou Drake. So this is a picture down on the bottom corner of Mary Lou in her home ec classroom teaching in Cedar Rapids. So she went from being a teacher in Cedar Rapids to being in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. So we know that Mary Lou went on to further training. She received about a year of training after she left Fort Des Moines. She trained in Arkansas, Mississippi, and Texas. We know that she received training in the maintenance field because she became a vehicle maintenance inspector. And I think the word that Daryl used was a tough vehicle maintenance inspector. So she was very tough. We also know that she received some supply training because she did work in supply. And we think that these photos were probably taken when she was undergoing some training in Arkansas. We have a couple pictures of Mary Lou here. The photo on your left is of Mary Lou and her fiance Barney, and Barney was later killed in action, and Mary Lou actually never wed after Barney's death. And the photo on the right is Mary Lou with her brother Donald Fred Drake, and Donald Fred Drake is Daryl Drake's father. And so this is a picture of Mary Lou with Daryl Drake's father. Mary Lou actually had 3 other siblings who served, male siblings who served. So the Women's Army Corps went overseas. Women served overseas, and these were very, very coveted assignments. Now, they are the only service that allowed women to go overseas. The other services allowed women to serve a few women to serve in Hawaii, which was a territory at that point in time. And one service, the Coast Guard, allowed women to serve in both Hawaii and in Alaska. But the Army sent women to North Africa, the Mediterranean, Europe, Southwest Pacific, China, India, Burma, and the Middle East. And so women went all over the world when they were in the Army. But as I said, the assignments were very, very coveted, and only the very best got to go. And it was so coveted that many women gave up the chance to attend officer candidate school in favor of getting this overseas assignment. So we had WACs that went to the Southwest Pacific Theater, and we had 5,500 of them. They were originally sent to Australia, and then later they were shipped out to where they were going to serve. When they were shipped to Australia, they were shipped in winter uniforms, and when they went to their assignments, they went in winter uniforms, and this caused a great deal of trouble. Eventually, more than 25% of them were evacuated, basically due to the fact that they had the wrong clothing. And so they suffered disease that was directly attributable to the fact that they had the wrong clothing, and they were unable to obtain lighter clothing. So these women performed extremely well in the Southwest Pacific Theater, but they performed, it came at a very high cost to them personally. For some of them, it was their health while they were in the service. For others, it was their health after they left the service. But performance in this theater generally came at a very high personal cost to them. This is Mary Lou again, and we know that Mary Lou was sent to Hollandia in New Guinea. Now this was very interesting because Mary Lou did not go to Australia first. She was shipped directly to Hollandia, and she was stationed near MacArthur's headquarters. She spent a year there, and these are some photos that she had from the time that she was in Hollandia. So there we have General MacArthur's headquarters. The picture at the far right is of Mary Lou and another woman, and they were on General MacArthur's personal yacht at that time. On the bottom, Mary Lou taking advantage of the sea there, going going swimming. And then there's some New Guinea natives that she took a picture of. So Mary Lou spent about a year serving in Hollandia. And then she went to the Philippines to process out of the Army on December 6, 1945. It appears to Daryl and I that at that point in time, she became a Department of Army civilian. She was mustered out of the Army, but she remained on and served in Japan with MacArthur until 1950. And she then worked with the Department of Labor and did 2-year assignments in Vietnam, China, Japan, India, and Europe. So she continued to travel. When she was in the United States, she lived in Georgetown, DC, and then after her retirement, she moved back to Cedar Rapids, Iowa, to be near family. So we see that the end strength, well, the strength of women in December of 1944, April of 1945 was 99,000. So that was what was on active duty at the end of the war, and then it downsizes very quickly. It goes down to under 10,000 in December by December of 1946. So the women continued to serve in the Women's Army Corps after the war was over, but in very small numbers. But the Army Corps was a branch of the Army. It became a branch of the Army, just like the Signal Corps or infantry was a branch in the Army. So the Women's Army Corps continued on. Some of the women's reserve units did not continue on after World War II. Now, Sergeant Mary Lou Drake was buried in Brooklyn, Iowa. She lived until she was 93. So Brooklyn she was buried in a cemetery that was just miles from where she had lived as a child. So Daryl had this put on her tombstone because this was something that she used to say to Daryl. She said, "MacArthur and I won the war in the South Pacific, and then we repatriated Japan." So that's something that she used to say. We don't think she worked with MacArthur, but she really felt like what she had done was very, very important, and it directly contributed to what happened and what was happening around it. So her work she considered to be very important. So I think I've missed a slide. Just a minute. I want to go back. Okay, so the next group that we're going to look at is the U.S. Navy Women's Reserve. So they were called the WAVs. You probably always wondered what the WAVs stood for, and it stands for Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service. Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service. So the bill that established them was signed into law on June 30th of 1942. And by fall of 1942, they had 10,000 WAVs had been trained. They had more than 8,000 officers and 88,000 enlisted women who joined the WAVs during World War II. Mildred Mcafee became the first director of the WAVs. She was at Wellesley. She was the college president at Wellesley. And at 36, she was the youngest president they'd had at Wellesley. And not only that, I believe she was the youngest college president at that time anywhere. And she took a leave of absence from Wellesley and when she was appointed director in August of 1942. And when she resigned at the end of the war in 1945, she returned to Wellesley and to her position. So our Iowa connection to the Waves is that they trained at the Iowa State Teachers College. So there were 1,500 who arrived for indoctrination training in December of 1942. So indoctrination training is the same as basic training, but it was called indoctrination training at that point in time. So December in Iowa, in northern Iowa, you had these women who came in from the south to northern Iowa. They were shipped in by train, and they came in and they were wearing open-toed shoes, and they had light summer dresses on with summer jackets on. They certainly weren't prepared for the snow that met them when they arrived in Iowa. And not only did they have to contend with that, but the barracks that they were staying in was Bartlett Hall, and Bartlett Hall was of course had been a women's dorm, but they had brought everything in that the women needed. You know, there were bed frames there and mattresses, and there was the sheets for the women, and each one of them had a dresser or they had a wall locker. All of that was there in the room, and none of it was put together. The bed frames had not been put together. The mattresses had not been put on the bed frames. And so these women arrived at night and in the inappropriate clothing. And when they got to their rooms, finally, they had to put everything together, put the bed frames together, put the mattresses on the bed, put the sheets on the bed, move the wall lockers and dressers and beds to where they were supposed to be in the room. And so it was not a lovely beginning in Iowa for the Waves. But it was so successful that the Waves actually asked for more space at the Iowa State Teachers College in order to continue this indoctrination training and bringing the number of women in that they needed to bring in. But the Iowa State Teachers College, after they signed the contract with the Waves, had also signed a contract with the Army, and they were also housing and training the Army Air Corps, future Army Air Corps pilots there. They were receiving some training there. And so there literally was no more room at the Iowa State Teachers College. And so the indoctrination training was then moved to Hunter College in 1943. And by April of 1943, they'd stopped doing indoctrination training at Iowa State Teachers College, and it was yeoman's school. And a yeoman is a cleric, and so it was a clerical school for the Waves. And it closed in 1945, and by the time it closed in 1945, there were 14,000 Waves who had trained at the Iowa State Teachers College, either going through indoctrination training or indoctrination training and yeoman's training, or just yeoman's training. So 14,000 women trained at the Iowa State Teachers College. This is a picture of the women moving out of Bartlett Hall, the women's dorms. So they were packing up and moving out of Bartlett Hall, the students, to make room for the Waves to move into. And then once the Waves moved in, Bartlett Hall became the USS Bartlett. And it had a deck, it had a fore, it had an aft, it had all of the names, the Navy names, you know, they incorporated into the USS Bartlett. And so the USS Bartlett served through World War II. Now, the UNI library has a really, really extensive digital collection of things left over from the Waves. So the Waves had put out a newspaper called the Iowa Wave. There are over 50 editions of the Iowa Wave available at the UNI library. They had also done a magazine called the Iowa Wave, and there are fewer of those available because I think that was a monthly or semi-monthly publication. And there is a thesis that is really, really interesting. It talks about the women in their time at the Iowa State Teachers College and the community, what the community was thinking of it. And so the women who came into the Waves not only received their uniform, they also received a uniform allowance, allowing them to go into town and buy the hose or the shoes that they needed to have the uniforms actually fitted to them. They received a $200 initial uniform allowance to pay for all of the other things that they would need besides their actual uniforms. And so there are stories of the women going down and shopping in the community surrounding the Iowa State Teachers College. So because the SPARS, the Coast Guard, also fell under the Navy auspices during time of war, the SPARS also trained at the Iowa State Teachers College and then went on to Hunter College when they were doing indoctrination training at Hunter College. So they went through the same indoctrination training, and the uniforms were essentially the same except for the insignia. So it was very difficult to tell which was which from a distance, especially. But the SPARS also trained at the Iowa State Teachers College. And you can see the snow on the ground. You can see how lovely the Iowa State Teachers College was there during the winter of 1942-43. I wanted to highlight a woman from each of the services. So we're going to look at Rear Admiral Grace Hopper. So Grace Hopper was born in 1906. She received a BA from Vassar and her master and PhD in mathematics from Yale. She resigned a Vassar teaching position in order to join the Waves, and she was commissioned a lieutenant, junior grade, and worked on the Mark I, which was an early prototype of a computer. She was classified as a statistician in the Waves. And she went on after the war was over. She remained in the reserves until her retirement in 1966. So Grace Hopper was recalled to active duty in 1967. She retired in 1966, was recalled to duty in 1967. And then she retired again from active duty in 1971 and was recalled in 1972 back to active duty. And she continued to serve in active duty until 1986. She retired in 1986 as a Rear Admiral at the age of 79. She was the oldest active duty commissioned officer in the Navy. And so I don't think retirement sat well with Grace, because Grace continued to work full-time in the computer area, and she lectured very widely until her death in 1985. And so that is Rear Admiral Grace Hopper, who started her career in the Waves. So what did the Waves do? Well, they did all kinds of things. I think in all of the services, there was this idea that the women would serve mainly in clerical positions, but it didn't take very long for the services to recognize that women could do other things besides sit in front of a typewriter. And so they served in clerical, healthcare, and storekeeping. Now, what is storekeeping? Well, it's basically supply. So they were the Army equivalent of a supply sergeant. So they worked in supply. They served as aviation machinists and aviation metalsmiths. So you see a couple women working on aircraft here. They were parachute riggers, control tower operators, statisticians like Grace Hopper, and they were able to serve in the United States, and they were able to serve in Hawaii. So at this point in time, I'm going to take a little break and answer some questions. Does anybody have any questions? I'll take a few questions at this point in time, and then we'll start in with the second half.
There is a question in the list. One comment, my mother joined the Waves in July 1943, served mostly in Ottumwa, Iowa. That was from Jane from here in South Dakota. Another one, Kathy has a question. Did the women's training include using weapons?
No, the women's training did not include using weapons because women were non-combatants and they would have no need for a weapon. So no, it did not include weapons.
One more, were there any women pilots during World War II?
There were women pilots during World War II. There was an organization called the Women's Air Service Pilots, the WASPs. And they, again, were not military, and their service was not recognized until 1977. Carter signed a bill recognizing the WASP service as having been military service. And as part of that bill that he signed, there was a line that stated that any organization in a similar position would also, their service would be recognized. And that is how the Hello Girls service was finally recognized, was through the recognition of the WASPs.
Wow.
So I know that, for example, when there was women who were killed, who died, whose planes crashed and they died, and the women would have to actually take up, they'd have to contribute in order to be able to ship the woman's body back home or to bury her. They were just not part of the military and they were not taken care of. Any other questions?
Marcy has a question. Go ahead, Marcy. You have your hand raised.
A couple of questions. The Hello Girls, they were from AT&T, right? I heard they were operators who spoke French, so they were very valuable overseas.
They were.
Were all of them from AT&T, or there other Hello Girls?
Well, most of them had experience as a switchboard operator, and one of the requirements was that they had to be able to speak French, so that they could understand what the French were asking, and they could connect the phone calls between the French and the Americans.
Also, did they find out who was behind the smear campaign against the women?
Well, it started, I think, with an editorial or an article in a specific newspaper written by one gentleman, and I do not off the top of my head know which newspaper that was. It was a major newspaper, either in the New York area or the Chicago area.
There's a couple more questions online here too.
Okay.
I hope I don't say this incorrectly. What happened to the 6888 group after they fixed the mail issue?
The 6AAA went on to continue to handle the mail in Europe. They were directory, a postal directory unit, and so they had a little piece of paper on every single service member that was in Europe. And every time the service member moved, they made changes so that they could get the mail to the service member. No mail, low morale was their motto. Yes.
Wow. Next question, what about sexual harassment that has gained attention in the last few years?
There's no written information about sexual harassment at that point in time. I'm sure that I don't, you know, women were regarded differently at that point in time than they are now. The people were more deferential to women then than they are now. But I'm certain that there were probably some unwanted advances that took place. I mean, that's just, there have always been unwanted advances towards women, whether they were in the military or whether they were civilians. So, okay, I think we will go on, and we
Okay.
will now look at the Coast Guard. Semper Patraeus, always ready. So they took their name from the Coast Guard mottos, Semper Patraeus, always ready. But if you know anything about boats, you know that a spar is a very significant thing as far as boats and ships were concerned. A spar is a long pole. It could be a mast. It could be the horizontal pieces that went across also. So it has a nautical meaning as well as being the meaning of, you know, being the their motto. So the Coast Guards were known as spars. And so the Coast Guard Reserve was established on November 23rd. Their director was Lieutenant Dorothy Stratton. So Dorothy Stratton was the former Dean of Women at Purdue University, and she transferred to the Coast Guards. She was a Navy lieutenant, and she transferred to the Coast Guards and became the director of the spars. So the spars started by transferring women from the Navy into the spars. There were 153 enlisted and 15 wave officers who agreed to be discharged from the Navy and join the Coast Guard spars. And so that was the nucleus of the spars. And they had basically 12,000 enlisted women and 1,000 women officers who served as spars during World War II. So as I was researching this, I found out some very interesting things that I did not know. And that is that, you know, the lightkeeping service became part of the Coast Guard at some point, but there had been women who served as lightkeepers going clear back into 1776. And so in 1776, John Thomas joined the Continental Army to fight the Revolutionary War, and his wife Hannah took over his job as the keeper of the Gurnett Point Light near Plymouth, Massachusetts. So this is a photo of the current Gurnett Point Light. This is not a photo or a drawing of the light that existed in 1776, but here we have our first woman lightkeeper, recognized as a lightkeeper. And they figured that there were 200 women who served as lightkeepers until lightkeepers were finally retired. And I think that happened in 1948, that they had the last lightkeeper leave. So women had been a part of the Coast Guard for a long time. I also didn't know that there were women who served in the Coast Guard during World War I. So Myrtle Hazard actually enlisted in the Coast Guard on January 31st, 1918 as an electrician and a radio operator. She served as an electrician first class and left the service when she left the service in 1918. So she actually enlisted into the Coast Guard. And we have twins over on the right-hand side, Genevieve and Lucille Baker, and they transferred from the Coast Guard to the Naval Coastal Defense Reserves in the summer of 1918. And there were also yeomanettes who worked with the Coast Guard at Coast Guard headquarters, but they remained yeomanettes. But we do have these women who did serve in the Coast Guard during World War I. And there's actually a Coast Guard cutter that is named the Myrtle Hazard. And so there's a Coast Guard cutter named after Myrtle Hazard. So SPAR training and the Iowa connection. Okay, so the first women to enlist in the SPARs were sent to Iowa State Teachers College to a Joint Wave SPAR training center. And of course, that did not last very long. It then became a yeoman training center, and the indoctrination training was then done later at Hunter College in New York City. They also did indoctrination at Palm Beach, Florida, and later at Manhattan Beach, New York. So 700 of the 978 SPAR officers were trained alongside male officers at the Coast Guard Academy. So think about this. I mean, the Coast Guard Academy actually opened up their doors and allowed this training to happen at the Coast Guard Academy. These women were not midshipmen. They had not been admitted to the academy. They were not going through a 4-year program to become a Coast Guard officer, but they were allowed to take their officer training. I think it was 4 to 6 weeks. They were allowed to take that officer training at the Coast Guard Academy. And so I think that the Coast Guard, probably because they had had women as lightkeepers and had been officially with the Coast Guard for a long period of time, that they were probably much more accepting and open to this idea of women being part of the Coast Guard. So the woman that we are going to look at as a SPAR is Olivia Hooker. So this started out, I found this picture on the top right of these two Black women SPARs, and I started clicking and researching this, and Olivia Hooker is the one on the bottom. Olivia Hooker's the one on the bottom, and she was one of the first Black SPARs. Not the first, they don't know who the first, but she was one of the first Black SPARs. And so this is a picture of Olivia Hooker. So I started clicking and finding out about Olivia Hooker, and it was interesting. So Olivia Hooker actually survived the Tulsa Race Riot Massacre. So I don't know if you're aware of the Tulsa Race Riot. It was called the Tulsa Race Riot, and then the name was later changed to Tulsa Race Massacre many years later. They think that one reason why it was called a race riot was because then insurance did not have to pay to rebuild any of this. So what happened was in Tulsa, there was a very vibrant Black community called Greenwood in Tulsa. And a resident of that community had a shoe shine stand, and his employer had made arrangements for him to use the Black bathroom, which was on the top floor of the building next to where he worked. And one day he got on the elevator and took the elevator up, and they think that what happened was he tripped and fell. And as he tripped and fell, he grabbed the woman elevator operator, the white woman elevator operator, and she screamed. And he went running from the elevator and was later picked up and charged with molesting this woman. But she claimed that the only thing that happened was that he grabbed her arm. But they thought that he would be lynched. There was a lynching party there that wanted to lynch him. And so some of the young members who had been in World War I of this Greenwood community decided that they felt like they had been asked by the sheriff to come down and help to guard him, to keep him from this lynching party. And so they went down, and somehow shots were fired. I think there were 30 of them that went down that were armed, and shots were fired. And within 2 days, they had completely decimated. They went into Greenwood. The sheriff deputized this whole group, this whole lynching party, and deputized anybody else who had a gun to go into Greenwood. And if you see the pictures of Greenwood after the race riot massacre, It looks like the pictures of Germany after Germany had been bombed. Everything was basically leveled. They figured that there were 35 city blocks, 35 to 40 city blocks that were completely leveled. 12,000 homes were destroyed. There were over 800 that were injured, and they estimate that there were 300 who were killed. The Oklahoma National Guard was called in not to stop the race, not to stop this, but to gather all of the living residents and to detain them in holding centers. Greenwood pretty much ceased to exist after that. But anyway, Olivia Hooker lived in Tulsa, lived in Greenwood, and her mother hid her and her sisters under the table and covered this table with a long tablecloth. But Olivia could hear the men in the house and with axes breaking up furniture in the house. Olivia was one of the last living survivors, and she testified to Congress in 2005 about the race massacre. So she was born in 1915, and she testified in 2005 at the age of 90. She was one of the first Black women to join the SPARS in February of 1945, and she achieved the rank of Petty Officer Second Class. She went on to receive her master's degree and her PhD in psychology and became an associate professor at Fordham University. So Olivia retired from Fordham at the age of 87, and I guess she thought she didn't have enough to do. So at 95, she joined the Coast Guard Auxiliary in Yonkers, New York. And so Olivia lived until 2018 and died at the age of 103. So there's a dining facility on Staten Island and a training facility at the Coast Guard headquarters named after her in 2015. And there is a U.S. Coast Guard cutter due out in 2023 that will be named the Olivia Hooker. So what did women do in the Coast Guard? So most of the women served as yeomen and storekeepers, but some attended Navy schools and trained as motion picture sound technicians, link trainer operators, parachute riggers, and air control operators. And some attended Coast Guard schools to be trained as cooks, bakers, radio men, pharmacist mates, radio technicians, and motor vehicle drivers. There was a Loran unit, which was an early form of an electronic beacon being sent out at Chatham, Massachusetts, that became the only all-female unit in the Coast Guard and was actually commanded by a female officer. So the SPARS served in every Coast Guard station in the continental U.S., and they also served in Alaska and Hawaii. Okay, I need to go back, sorry. Okay. So the next group we're going to look at is the Marines. So in World War I, you know, they had been the Marine Fs, which then gets translated to Marinettes, but now they're just the Marines. They are just the Marines. And the Marines were the last ones to actually allow women to enter the Marine Corps. Their first enlistments weren't until February 1943, and their first 6 officers were given direct commissions. And they basically brought 19 wave officer candidates over to become Marines and to help recruit women Marines. But they did not have Marine uniforms, so they were out recruiting women to join the Marine Corps with their wave uniform. The first director of the Marine Corps Women's Reserve was Ruth Cheney Streeter. So Ruth Cheney Streeter was born in Brooklyn. She attended Bryn Mawr College for 2 years. She was the wife of a prominent lawyer and the mother of 3 sons in the military and a daughter. So she had absolutely, she had 20 years of active civic work, but no paying job. But we know that many women who have never held a paying job have a lot of administrative skills. And so that was one of the reasons why she was chosen to be the director. She learned to fly, and she had a commercial flying license, and she bought a small plane, and she really wanted to be a member of the Women's Air Service Pilots. And she applied 5 times to be a Women's Air Service pilot, but was turned down. She finally applied for the WAVs, but she was told when she applied for the WAVs that she would not be able to fly. In January 23rd, 1943, she was sworn in as the director. So all of the directors were basically majors. They were majors. And then in late 1943, they were able to become colonels, 06s, colonels. But they were originally all majors and then later became colonels. But only one woman could be a colonel in the service. You couldn't have 2 women being a colonel in the service. Only one woman was allowed from each service to be a colonel, and that remained in place until about 1965, when women were allowed to move up in rank and become general officers, and you could have more than one woman colonel in your Women's Army Corps or your Marine Corps. So I love these pictures of these women enlisting into the Marine Corps. I especially love the one on the bottom right of these women lined up. These are obviously women who were enlisted. They lined up and they've got all of their suitcases there. And having been in the Army, I keep wondering, what are they going to do with these suitcases that they brought with them? So, I know that there were thousands of women who applied, lined up to be a Marine, but they did not take that many women into the Marine Corps. So you had to be a U.S. citizen. You couldn't have any children under 18. You had to be at least 5 feet tall, and you couldn't weigh less than 95 pounds. And the main thing was that they did not allow any Japanese American or Black women into the Marine Corps. And enlistments, I think in all services, were basically for the duration of the war plus 6 months. The woman that we're going to talk about now is Montana's connection to the Marine Corps, and that is Minnie Spotted Wolf. So Minnie Spotted Wolf was the first Native American woman to join any branch of the service, and she joined the Marines in September 1943. So because Minnie was the first, they took some stock photographs of Minnie, and there was a lot of press releases about Minnie Spotted Wolf, and there was also a comic book that was put out for young girls about Minnie Spotted Wolf. When Minnie Spotted Wolf passed away, her daughter said, these stock photos, there's one of her shooting a bow and arrow. She said, my mother said that wasn't her. She didn't do that. She said, but the comic book, she said that really was her mother's story before she joined the Marines. This was what she did before she joined the Marines. So she grew up on a very isolated ranch near Heart Butte, Montana, and I think that is in the northwest corner of Montana. It's up in the northern Montana. And she was on the Blackfoot Reservation. Minnie Spotted Wolf was a full-blooded Blackfoot. So she helped her family raise cattle, sheep, and horses. She drove a 2-ton truck. She mended fences, and she broke horses. So she was basically just a really, really hard working ranch woman, and then she joins the Marines. And after basic training, she worked as a truck driver and a mechanic, And I would have think that she was driving that 2-ton truck on the ranch, that she probably learned something about some mechanical skills prior to actually joining the Marine Corps. She was discharged in 1947, and she received she used her GI Bill to go back, and she received a 2-year degree in elementary education, later went back and received her bachelor's degree, and she taught school for 29 years. Minnie Spotted Wolf died in 1988. So this is Minnie Spotted Wolf. Minnie Spotted Wolf was the first Native American woman to join any branch of the military. So the Marine Corps Women's Reserve started out late, but they worked hard to try to catch up. So you have the first class of 71 officer candidates entered the Naval Midshipman School at Mount Holyoke. And after that first class of officer candidates, then all the later officer candidates were done at Camp Lejeune. So all of the training was actually moved to Camp Lejeune. So the first class of 722 enlisted women's reserve began training at the U.S. Naval Training School at Hunter College in the Bronx, once again training with the waves because the Marines fell under the Navy. So one thing that I really, really liked about the Marine Corps was that by October, the first group of women officer candidates started on the 13th of March. By October of 1943, they had ceased doing that. And in order to become an officer in the Marine Corps Women's Reserve, they had to have been enlisted, and they had to have had 6 months of service and be recommended by their commander and approved by a board of officers. And so I like that model, and they moved directly to that model so that women actually came from the enlisted ranks to be officers in the Marine Corps Women's Reserve. So what sorts of things did they do? Well, their specialties ranged from cooks to clerks, transport personnel to mechanics. So about half of the women in the Marine Corps Women's Reserve were clerical, were yeomen, and about 1/3 of them were assigned to aviation units. And so you've got the women over here on the right that were working in aviation. I love this picture on the top where the women are, the wings of the planes actually folded, and so they're lifting a wing up and putting it back in place. You've got the women who were rigging the parachute down on the bottom left, and you could see how intricate rigging the parachute was, that it had to be folded just a very specific way, and especially those lines had to be done just right, folded just right, so that they didn't get tangled as the men exited the plane. And then you've got the women who are actually working as mechanics in the motor pool. So women did a lot of other things. They actually attended 30 different specialist schools in the Marine Corps Women's Reserve. So the Marine Corps Women's Reserve did send a few women to Hawaii. So I love this picture because you've got these few women coming off the ship in Hawaii. Now, if you look behind them, you'll see that there is a brass band playing for these women as they get off the ship. So they served in all of the states, and there were a small number that were assigned to Hawaii. And just under 19,000 women served in the Marines in World War II, and about 1,000 of those were women officers. So This is the number of women who served in World War II. We had 19,000 Marines, 96,000 Navy women, it's over 150,000 Army women, 13,000 Coast Guard women. That totals 278. And then if we add our Nurse Corps in, our Army Nurse Corps at 57,000, and our Navy Nurse Corps in at 11,000, we have 346 women who served. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining me today for a look at the women who served in the military during World War II. We probably have time for one more question. Is there another question?
We've got a few. Go ahead, Marcy.
Just a note on Grace Hopper was important in computer programming. She created the first computer language compiler, which then led to COBOL, a language I used actually in the 70s.
Ah, yeah.
Interesting.
She remained in computers, throughout her life. That's what she worked in since she started with the Mark I during World War II.
I'm going to send you a copy of the chat here, Mary Lou, because there are some interesting statements and stories that people have that they wanted to relay on to you.
Okay.
So I will send you a copy of that. If we didn't get to your question today, feel free to email me that and I will send it on to Mary Lou. Do we have time for one more?
Sure.
Okay. Dave asks, in reference to, oh shoot, I can't think of her name, the one who tried 5 times to fly.
I think it was Stratton
Yes.
with the Women's Army. Yes. Yeah.
Yes. He said, do you know why they kept turning her down? Why couldn't she fly?
I have no idea because she had her pilot's license. I don't know why she was turned down. I don't know, but she applied 5 times. That's what she wanted more than anything else.
Wow. Wow. Well, we've had a lot of people here today. I have right around on my list about 97 people that attended today. So thank you. Obviously, this is an important and incredible topic for everyone. Also, I just want to note, Dorothy says, thank you for sharing this important event, talking about the Tulsa Massacre. Thank you for sharing this important event in African-American history. Greenwood was surely a haven for Black people before it was destroyed. Lots of people said thank you, and I'll send you a copy of this because it's so nice. You're gonna love all this.
Okay. Well, this really has been very, very it's exciting for me to be selected to do this. So it's been fun. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Oh gosh, I will. If people want to hang out for just a minute more, I will get the
survey will be posted in just a second.
Thank you, Stacy. I get so caught up in everything that I didn't get the survey out there. Thank you, Stacy, for taking care of that. We'll have that posted if everybody wants to hang on for just a second.
Mary Lou, do you want to stop sharing your screen so we can see the whole group of folks?
Oh, yes. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yep.
There we go. And that survey is still coming. It was all set up here. Tell you what, the survey is going to come out in an email later. How's that? Thank you, everyone.
Now you all can see why we love Mary Lou at OLLI at Iowa State. So she's just an awesome, awesome instructor, lots of great ideas, and we just think she's wonderful. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for attending. See you Thursday for our last OLLI Extra.
And a quick shout out to Dorothy. I hope she hasn't left yet. Dorothy is one of our OLLI members who lives in Pennsylvania.
Oh, wow.